Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Kahn. And in this video, we're going over The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. So Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, Algerian-born French novelist, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. So, in this article, he's talking about the meaning of life, or the lack of a meaning in life, in a universe without God. So he's an atheist. He's talks about a lot of the same topics that Jean-Paul Sartre talked about, and I'll refer back to him a little bit as we get into this. So he's asking you to think about suicide. If there's no God, so therefore there's no eternal meaning of life in this meaningless universe, why not just kill yourself? Because it's just this pointless effort. Every day you go through the daily grind. For what purpose? When you're dead, it would be, from your perspective, as if you never existed. There's nothing. And this he'll relate at the end of this reading to the myth of Sisyphus, who was a man who's tortured by the gods for some offenses he gave to them, to every day push a big boulder up a steep hill all the way to the top, only to have it roll back down every day. So for Camus, he says, that's like our life, this meaningless, horrible burden. But on the way down, after pushing the rock up the hill and realizing his futile existence, Sisyphus can have this joy and this absurd realization of the meaninglessness of this cruel world. So says Camus. And similarly, we can do the same. He says we have to develop what he calls this absurd consciousness, this consciousness of the absurdity of our situation, given the fact of the end of all meaning with death. If we revolt against the temptation of suicide and embrace this realization of that we live in an absurd, meaningless world, then that will give us freedom from the illusion of any eternal, meaningful freedom to be attained in heaven, or basically to be attained in heaven after life. If there's no freedom in the eternal afterworld, there's no real freedom. It's a limited form of human freedom. So this revolt from the meaninglessness of life, and at the same time rejecting suicide, embracing the absurdness of reality, and living that kind of constant tension passionately at every moment in the face of a meaningless universe. This is his philosophy. So let me just start reading some. It's a long reading and it's very dense. So, and this will be addressing for exam 6, part A. Question 3, Camus, Taylor, Wolfe, and Vitrano present more recent discussions of the meaning of life. What do you find most insightful in these writings? Why? And explain. So if you find anything most insightful from this reading, then you would want to write about why did you find this to be so insightful. I think he's got some insightful things to say. I believe in God, but if I didn't believe in God, I think this would be an interesting, I mean, it is an interesting read whether you believe in God or not, but I think he really addresses this problem with a lot of passion, which is one of his guides to living a good life in a meaningless universe. So part B, exam 6, question 6, explain Camus' discussion of suicide. And part B, question 7, explain Camus' comments on the myth of Sisyphus. So I've briefly gone over all of that, and now I will get into some of the details here. Okay, page 553, an absurd reasoning, absurdity and suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. All right, so we've got a pretty good beginning for one of those exam questions. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. And if it is true, I'm skipping a little bit, as Nietzsche claims that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. So, is life worth living? obviously the reply to that question is important, because if you find that it's not, you'll kill yourself. So continuing, he says, the truth was not worth the stake. All right, so if he talks about Galileo, why did Galileo recant his position that the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around? Because he didn't want to be burned at the stake. He didn't want to be killed. It wasn't worth losing his life. Expressing the truth of the solar system was insignificant compared to the infinite importance of just living. So he says, this is how he explains it. The truth was not worth the stake. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. So is there a meaning in life? Most people would think if you say no, then suicide is the most reasonable option. Camus says the opposite. And then he'll conclude, as a matter of fact, the fact that life has no meaning is what makes it worth living. Because if it had a meaning, some purpose toward which it's aspiring, then it is just a means to an end. If it has no meaning, then it is what it is itself. It's an end unto itself. A meaningless and absurd end, but it's not a means to some other end, at least. Okay, so then on page 554, he talks about how the idea of suicide creeps into people's minds like a great work of art, he says. Slowly but surely, it builds up the thought that life is not worth living. He goes, of an apartment building manager who had killed himself, I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that he had changed greatly since, and that the experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. So this is what he's going to say about the importance of having this undermining effect of realizing the cruel meaninglessness of life. It forces you to become conscious. Before that, you just carry along life in this rote habit. But when you're confronted with the possible meaninglessness of it all, that awakens your consciousness, he'll go on to explain. And then you have two choices: suicide, or just going back to sleep and forgetting about how meaningless it all is, or embracing the recognition of the meaninglessness of it all and rejecting suicide, which is what he says is the most reasonable solution. So in the left-hand column, 554, he says, in a sense, and as in a melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you, or that you do not understand it, that it is not worth the trouble. Because living naturally is never easy. You continue making the gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. Okay, when you start to realize that litany of negative meaninglessness indicating characteristics of the universe, that awakens you to your consciousness as a human being. He goes, what then is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world, but on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. Okay, so he did his master's thesis on St. Augustine, and discussing how St. Augustine adopted the Platonic philosophy. According to Plato's philosophy, which we went over in the Republic, this entire universe radiates from these absolute archetypal forms of knowledge, the ideas, all of which are contained in the idea of the good, which, if you combine various Platonic dialogues like the Timaeus, the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, the Republic, you can see this idea of the good as a universal soul located in the centralmost point and at each point of the encompassing sphere of the universe. Out at that outermost spheres where the absolute ideas exist, the perfect infinite forms from which all of the imperfect material approximations are radiated. They exist at the outermost horizon of the universe, where a soul goes after it dies if it's been practicing philosophy. The soul can perceive these absolute forms of knowledge from whence this material universe is projected. Those absolute forms of knowledge give the universe its meaning. The idea of the good, which encompasses them all, is the ultimate meaning, and Augustine equated that idea of the good with God. So when he goes on to here to say that, but on the other hand, a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. The illusions and the lights, which were removed from our understanding of the universe historically, and he'll go on to talk about this, for centuries we have been thinking this way. So he's talking about essentially Christian Europe, thinking of this universe as a projection of the light of God's mind, the logos out from this outermost sphere of the universe. I find that especially interesting, as I've mentioned in previous videos, because holographic string theory, which unites quantum mechanics and general relativity, says the same basic thing, that the universe explodes from a central singularity, and it expands, space-time expands at an exponential rate. It reaches the speed of light at the horizon of the cosmos, which is the sphere from our perspective on Earth, where the expansion of space-time reaches the speed of light. The past, present, and the future are recorded there, and they radiate in on these fundamental threads to create the cinematic hologram of three-dimensional space. So the past, present, and future radiate from the cosmic horizon, just like Plato said. So I say that because Camus did not have knowledge of string theory. So when did he die? He died in 1960, so there was no way he could have had knowledge of string theory. The first version came out, I believe, 1968 or 69. This holographic string theory came out in the early 1990s. But the lights that were removed from our understanding of the universe, to me it seems, have returned through developing mathematical physics. But if that wasn't the case, and there's just this soulless, random universe that hiccuped from some mathematical probabilities that have no concern or personality, this is the worldview that he's living in. And how do you get along in that worldview as a human being when you have this desire not to die, this instinct for life? So continuing here, he says, now we're in this universe divested of all light and soul. He says his exile is without remedy, since he's deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. All healthy men having thought of their own suicide, it can be seen without further explanation that there is a direct connection between this feeling and the longing for death. So cosmology is very important for him here. In a universe with no soul, the longing for death emerges, because it's just absurd. Why take the time to read these paragraphs in this book? Why take the time to study for your exam? Why take the time to make this video for people who are going to die, and I'm going to die, and when each of us dies, it's as if we did nothing at all. We might as well do nothing at all. We might as well just kill ourselves, some might think, and avoid all the pain. Why suffer to serve a master with no soul who doesn't care if we work or not? So how do you resist this temptation to end all this meaningless suffering? This is what he's writing about. So he says, okay, on the right-hand column of page 554, okay, you go through your daily grind, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm, so I guess they had 6 days to work then, but one day the why arises, and everything begins in that wariness tinged with amazement. Begins. That is important. Wariness comes at the end of the acts of a mechanical life, but at the same time it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. It awakens consciousness and provokes what follows. What follows is the gradual return into the chain, or it is the definitive awakening. At the end of the awakening comes in time the consequence, suicide or recovery. In itself, wariness has something sickening about it. Here I must conclude that it is good, for everything begins with consciousness, and nothing is worth anything except through it. Okay, so you have this wariness tinged with amazement. You're going through your life every day, the same routine, wake up the same time, go to work. We're in the coronavirus era, so things have changed. Our routines have been disrupted, but even during the pandemic, there's a routine that develops. It carries you along, but at some moments, this mechanical grind gives way to this wariness tinged with amazement. And what are you amazed about? How meaningless it all is. Okay, so then what happens? Either you sink back into the chain, this chain of causes and effects, which he doesn't believe in. He's probably influenced by David Hume there. You think that because you see regularly event A preceding event B, you assume event A causes event B, but you never empirically observe causality. So there's no actual causal chain, which would seem to give the ground for the understanding of a human being. My whole life is tied together by a chain of causes and effects. That makes me who I am. Well, if there's no cause and effect, then each of those links is separate, and there is no continuous human being. I believe that's what he's talking about, and therefore there's no meaning in life. You don't even really exist. There's no eternal soul. You're a series of unconnected moments. He even will say that later. And nevertheless, all those unconnected moments are contained in your own memory. And this is what you've got. That's all you've got. So live it to the fullest and drink life to the dregs is more or less what he's going to say. But continuing here, he says, so either you go back into the chain of the grind of daily life and just get on with it, or you kill yourself, or you recover. And what he means by recovery is you gain this appreciation for the absurdity of all, and you embrace it as the meaning of your life. The meaning of my life is the realization that there's no meaning in life. Oh, that's absurd. Exactly. Life is absurd. Recognize that, and that's the best thing you can do. So he goes on to say, likewise, enduring every day of an unillustrious life, time carries us, but moments always come when we have to carry it. So again, you're carried by the habits of life, but occasionally you wake up with this amazement, this wariness tinged by amazement, and you say, oh man, why bother? Now all of a sudden the weight of each moment is even more burdensome because you're recognizing the futility of it all. So he says, he admits that he stands at a certain point on a curve that he acknowledges having to travel to its end. So the curve is the curve of life, the end of it is death. Just that simple realization makes everything seem absurd because he does not believe in an afterlife. He belongs to time, and by the horror that seizes him, he recognizes his worst enemy, which is time ending in death. Tomorrow he was longing for tomorrow. Tomorrow, he was longing for tomorrow, whereas everything in him ought to reject it. That revolt of the flesh is the absurd. So a lot of times, a lot of our life we spend hoping for things to be better tomorrow in the future. Oh yeah, well maybe this door of opportunity will open, or I've got this plan and I'm going to do this tomorrow. So we yearn for the future. But he's saying you shouldn't, because there's no meaning in it, and all one more day is going to lead you is one more step closer to death, which is the end of all meaning. And that fact is absurd. The revolt of the flesh is the absurd, he says. So a step lower and strangeness creeps in, perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us. Okay, so the material universe is foreign to us. This is not our home. It seems so strange. It has no consciousness, this world around us. We alone have consciousness, it seems, on this forlorn universe, and it means nothing. To us, it's infinitely significant, but when we die, it fizzles out. The biochemical processes of the brain stop, and it's over. It didn't ever mean anything, and it might as well never have happened, and when the universe dies, all memory of it will be gone. So this is the realization we have to come to grips with constantly, he says. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees, at this very minute lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. Okay, so when the natural world loses this illusion with which we had clothed them, and he's saying we, he's talking mainly about Europeans over the past millennia or two, as he'll go on to say, the primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. For a second, we cease to understand it, because for centuries we have understood it in solely the images and designs that we had attributed to it beforehand, because henceforth we lack the power to make use of that artifice. The world evades us because it becomes itself again. That stage scenery masked by habit becomes again what it is. It withdraws at a distance from us. So the stage setting. So everyone's an actor and all the world's a stage. But the stage for Camus is just this soulless, godless universe. We used to see it as the mind of God radiating in from the outermost horizon, and that each human being had this natural light of reason with which we could identify the link between the material world and the world of the absolute ideas. Now that's gone. Now our stage scenery is just what it is, a soulless, dense, material world. And there is no God in the balconies observing it all. No one's observing it. It's a play performed for nobody. He says, just as there are days when under the familiar face of a woman we see as a stranger her we had loved months or years ago, perhaps we shall come even to desire what suddenly leaves us so alone. All right, so you look one day at your wife or your girlfriend and who's this? I thought I knew this person. And that's kind of what he's saying, the way we perceive the universe. Maybe one day we'll wish for the soulfulness of our understanding of the universe to return, but he's saying, but the time has not yet come. Just one thing, that denseness and that strangeness of the world is the absurd. Well, the time has come, I think, with holographic string theory. The entire universe is a projection from this outermost horizon, just like Plato and St. Augustine said. And as Europeans believed for centuries, up until the time of Galileo, whom he mentioned. And there's a reason he mentioned Galileo, because that was the beginning of the end of the Western mind's belief in the meaningfulness of the universe. So now, Absurd Freedom, page 555, the right-hand column. Now I can broach the notion of suicide. It has already been felt what solution might be given. At this point, the problem is reversed. It was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. If life has a meaning, a purpose to fulfill, then it is a means to an end. So if it doesn't have a purpose to fulfill, it is what it is. And its quality, its worthfulness, its I don't want to say meaning, because he's saying nothing has a meaning, but its value is found only in itself, and that makes it more worth living. So living and experience a particular fate is accepting it fully. Now, no one will live this fate knowing it to be absurd unless he does everything to keep before him that absurd thought to light by consciousness. So we have to be constantly aware. Everything we do is absurd. This is the method of thought, the philosophical posture he's trying to tell people to take. Recognize there's no God. Yes, it's meaningless, all of the suffering. It's meaningless, it's meaningless, it's meaningless. Isn't that absurd? He's saying just be aware of that constantly, and that will give you some joy in this brief and meaningless life. So the theme of permanent revolution is thus carried into individual experience. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive, it is above all contemplating it. Unlike Eurydice, the absurdities, so this is kind of a typo here. The absurd dies only when we turn away from it. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. All right, Eurydice. I forget the exact myth, but Eurydice was some mythological character's wife, and he asked to go back into the underworld to retrieve her from death, and the god of the underworld said, okay, but when you're coming back out of the underworld, don't look back at her. Wait until you're out in the world, otherwise she'll die. So he couldn't resist the temptation. He looked back and he saw her covered in worms and decayed, and she died. But he's saying, unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. So the absurd realization, the conscious revolt against the absurdity of existence, is simply recognizing it. If you revolt against it by recognizing that life is absurd, you're actually embracing it. You're saying, yes, you are an absurd life, and that's what I'm living, and that's what I intend to live. I do not intend to kill myself. All right, so then he goes on page 556, the left-hand column. It is an insistence upon an impossible transparency. It challenges the world anew every second. Just as danger provided man the unique opportunity of seizing awareness, so metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. It is that constant presence of man in his own eyes. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it. So he goes on to say, left-hand column, 556, suicide, like the leap, is acceptance at its extreme. Everything is over, and man returns to his essential history. His future, his unique and dreadful future, he sees and rushes towards it. In its way, suicide settles the absurd. So revolt, he's saying, is the proper attitude to have towards the absurdity, the meaninglessness of existence. Suicide is not revolting against the meaninglessness of existence. It's embracing it by rushing towards it and killing yourself. So he's saying it settles the absurd. Instead of keeping it alive in front of your consciousness, you kill your consciousness and it's over. So he engulfs the absurd in the same death. But I know that in order to keep alive, the absurd cannot be settled. It escapes suicide to the extent that it is simultaneously awareness and rejection of death. So the person with absurd consciousness realizes, I'm going to die, it's meaningless, but I'm not going to kill myself. So death is going to get me, but I am not going to surrender to it. It'll get me unwillingly. I'm a rebel to the end. So the contrary of suicide, in fact, is the man condemned to death. Someone condemned to death values life intensely, he's saying. This reminds me of a time in July of 1989. I was with some friends of mine, and we were waiting. So a big thunderstorm, one of these DC, Maryland downpours happened, and we have these open storm culverts where the water is channeled through these concrete artificial creeks, and we were body surfing in it. To make a long story short, the water got too high. We got sucked into these tunnels that went under the road, and I hung on the top of the tunnel as my legs were flapping, like, you know, my shorts got ripped off. I'm naked and my head is just barely above the top of this tunnel. The water's gushing over my head. I can't get out. I'm thinking maybe if I could pull myself up, I could saw my legs off on the corrugated metal. That's how desperate to live I was. I realized, no, that it's not sharp enough for one thing. I'd pass out. I'd bleed to death. So, but I do remember looking up and seeing a bird on an electric wire, and the cars driving by overhead. They couldn't see me, but I could see them driving above, and I realized that bird doesn't care. These people driving by, they're just living their daily lives. I'm undergoing this infinitely intense existential crisis where all meaning in life is about to die, and this world is just carrying on without a care. I remember feeling how horrible, just so dead I felt inside. So this, and all I wanted was life. And this is what he's trying to say. This is the real essence of the human condition, this burning flame of desire for life, which is slapped in the face by the realization of the ultimate and inescapable death of everything. So I just, there's an image that he's going to use later about this, the pure flame of life. That's the only thing, unbelievable disinterestedness with regard to everything except for the pure flame of life. That's what I was experiencing there in that sewer tunnel, getting sucked in. Okay, so I'm going to skip over to the right-hand column of page 556. Consciousness and revolt. These rejections are the contrary of renunciation. Everything that is indomitable and passionate in a human heart quickens them, on the contrary, with its own life. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is a repudiation. The absurd man can only drain everything to the bitter end and deplete himself. The absurd is his extreme tension, which he maintains constantly by solitary effort, for he knows that in that consciousness and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof of his only truth, which is defiance. So then he'll go on to say, all right, that's the first consequence of the realization of the absurdity of existence. He's got two more, which he summarizes on the right-hand column up at the top on page 559. I'll say them now and then we'll go back. Because thus I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. So we went over revolt. Acknowledge the absurdity of life, but rebel against it by refusing suicide. Just keep that consciousness of how absurd life is constantly before your eyes. That's the revolt. The freedom he'll talk about here. And basically what he's going to say is there's no eternal freedom, so there's no real actual freedom, but there's the limited kind of a freedom that a human can enjoy, and that's what I have. And embracing that humble realization of how absurd everything is gives me an inner sense of freedom similar to the mystics and the slaves. The mystics, he'll say on 557, the right-hand column, they surrender themselves to God and willingly become God's slave. And they feel free inwardly because they feel like this is their inescapable eternal fate. And the slave feels free from all responsibility. The master is responsible for everything, for whether I even eat or have clothes. So there's a freedom from responsibility. It's that kind of freedom, a mixture of a mystic and a slave, that the absurd man, the atheistic man who embraces the absurdity of existence, that's the kind of a freedom that someone who knows the absurdity of reality will experience. So I'll skip over to the left-hand column of page 557. Now I've got my neighbor here hammering on the wall. I'm sorry about that if you can hear that. He says, the only one I know is freedom of thought and action. Now, if the absurd cancels all my chances of eternal freedom, it restores and magnifies, on the other hand, my freedom of action. He goes, before encountering the absurd, the everyday man lives with aims, a concern for the future, or for justification. All right, this is where he's differing from Sartre. So before realizing how absurd everything is, people have aims and goals in life. And he'll go on to say, in truth, he acts as if he were free, even if all the facts make a point of contradicting that liberty. He goes, but at that moment I am well aware that the higher liberty, that freedom to be, which alone can serve as a basis for a truth, does not exist. Death is there as the only reality. After death, the chips are down. I am not even free either to perpetuate myself, but a slave, and above all, a slave without hope of an eternal revolution, without recourse to contempt. And who without revolution and without contempt can remain a slave? What freedom can exist in the fullest sense without assurance of eternity? Okay, so he's a slave who can't even have contempt for his master because there is no master. It's a meaningless mechanical universe. It's not enslaving us on purpose. It's just the fact that we are enslaved by unconscious existence and the laws of nature that force us to either work or die. So he goes, for the people who think there's a purpose in life, to the extent to which he imagined a purpose to his life, he adapted himself to the demands of a purpose to be achieved and became the slave of his liberty. So Sartre said, man is the plan that's aware of itself. That's how we become a human being. Self-awareness is seeing yourself achieving some goal in the future. It's getting outside of yourself by projecting yourself into some future act and perceiving the accomplishment of some goal. Camus is rejecting that. He goes, if there's no eternal freedom, then freedom is just this. You're free to have the thought of realizing how unfree you truly are. Because when you die, that's it. All meaning is gone. Death is the overarching infinite overlord whom you can't escape, and it doesn't know it is. It's just the absence of consciousness. But keeping that thought, that's the only freedom that you can really have. Keep that thought constantly in front of your mind. And because you can't have freedom if there's no God. If there's no eternal God, you know what, I'm going to go back and I skipped it, but let me just, this is the right-hand column, 556. He says, the problem of freedom as such has no meaning, for it is linked in a quite different way with the problem of God. Knowing whether or not man is free involves knowing whether he can have a master. The absurdity peculiar to this problem comes from the fact that the very notion that makes the problem of freedom possible also takes away all its meaning, for in the presence of God there is less a problem of freedom than a problem of evil. You know the alternative: either we are not free and God the all-powerful is responsible for evil, or we are free and responsible, but God is not all-powerful. So, there is no God, according to Camus. So that's the real question, and if there's no God, then this whole question of freedom becomes kind of absurd. Free to do what? To achieve some purpose? But all purposes are ultimately meaningless when you recognize that death will erase its significance for the people who had the purpose to begin with. All right, so I've gone over that. Now over on 558, left-hand column, losing oneself in that bottomless certainty, feeling henceforth sufficiently remote from one's own life to increase it and take a broad view of it. This involves the principle of a liberation. Such new independence has a definite time limit. Like any freedom of action, it does not write a check on eternity, but it takes the place of the illusion of freedom, which all stopped with death. The divine availability of the condemned man before whom the prison doors open in a certain early dawn, that unbelievable disinterestedness with regard to everything except for the pure flame of life, it is clear that death and the absurd are here the principles of the only reasonable freedom that which a human heart can experience and live. This is a second consequence. All right, so there's three consequences of this recognition of the absurdity of life: revolt, freedom, and then it'll go on to say passion. So then he goes, this is a second consequence. The absurd man thus catches sight of a burning and frigid, transparent, and limited universe in which nothing is possible, but everything is given, and beyond which all is collapse and nothingness. He can then decide to accept such a universe and draw from it his strength, his refusal to hope, and the unyielding evidence of a life without consolation. So it's very bleak, and he's saying, yes, you must embrace that to have a joyful life despite the absurdity of it all. But what does life mean in such a universe? Nothing else for the moment but indifference to the future and a desire to use up everything that is given. Belief in the meaning of life always implies a scale of values, a choice, our preference. Belief in the absurd, according to our definition, teaches the contrary. All right, so there's no longer a scale of values. There's no good or evil. This is something he's getting from Nietzsche. The masters will say what is good is themselves, indomitable people who oppress others for higher purposes of their own. The slaves will say, no, what is good is us, the slaves, and what is evil is the masters who oppress us. Camus is saying there is no scale. There is no good, there is no evil. It's just this meaningless, bizarre universe that has no goal, was not created by any intelligent being. And in such a world, there's no moral truths. And yet here he is, he's trying to give people a method by which to avoid suicide after recognizing this absurdity of life. So he goes on to talk about the difference between quantity and quality of life, that if there's no meaning in life, then life itself is the only valuable thing, and the more life, the better. What qualities of life don't really count, he's saying. It's the quantity of life. How much have you lived? And again, so here's this kind of his hedonistic tone where he's saying, since life is meaningless, you should just drink up everything that's given to you and enjoy what you can. So on the left-hand column of page 559, he goes, here we have to be oversimple. To two men living the same number of years, the world always provides the same sum of experiences. It is up to us to be conscious of them, being aware of one's life, one's revolt, one's freedom, and to the maximum is living, and to the maximum. Where lucidity dominates, the scale of values becomes useless. All right, so skipping down at the bottom of the left-hand column of page 559, it is not even his vocation, but merely the third consequence of his reasoning. This is the absurd man. Having started from an anguished awareness of the inhuman, the meditation on the absurd returns at the end of its itinerary to the very heart of the passionate flames of human revolt. Thus I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. I know, to be sure, the dull resonance that vibrates throughout these days, yet I have but a word to say, that it is necessary. When Nietzsche writes, quote, it clearly seems that the chief thing in heaven and on earth is to obey at length and in a single direction. In the long run, there results something for which it is worth the trouble of living on this earth, as, for example, virtue, art, music, the dance, reason, the mind, something that transfigures, something delicate, mad, or divine. So when Nietzsche says that, he elucidates the rule of a really distinguished code of ethics, but he also points the way of the absurd man. Obeying the flame is both the easiest and the hardest thing to do. So Nietzsche says, all right, it's a meaningless world, so then the chief thing is to obey in a single direction for a long time. So this is another thing that Camus is saying that you should try to do, as he does himself. He's written this article, I'm sure it took him a long time, and he just focused on this one idea. Life is absurd. How do you live with that? And so he's produced, he says, something that's worthwhile, and that's obeying the flame. The flame is the passion for life. Nietzsche called it the will to power. So Camus taking elements of Nietzsche, but Nietzsche's idea of the will to power is much more like God than one would normally think from a guy who said God is dead. The will to power, he personifies as Dionysus. He has this idea of the eternal return. So there is, you don't really ever die, because your existence returns after a great cycle of time, again and again, infinitely into the past and the future. But at any rate, Camus clearly influenced by Nietzsche here. What he's calling absurd, the awareness of the absurd, Nietzsche, he's probably borrowing from Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, where the person who has a tragic consciousness, who realizes the tragic nature of the cosmos. Camus talking about the absurd nature of the cosmos, and Nietzsche was focusing on the tragic nature of the cosmos, but I'm not going to get into that. Let's skip. So now, the myth of Sisyphus. Okay, so I'll just start reading here, 560 on the left. The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought with some reason that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. All right, so there's three different versions of why Sisyphus was condemned to this fate. I think the one that's most pertinent is that it is said that Sisyphus, being near to death, rashly wanted to test his wife's love. He ordered her to cast his unburied body into the middle of the public square. Sisyphus woke up in the underworld, and there, annoyed by an obedience so contrary to human love, he obtained from Pluto permission to return to Earth in order to chastise his wife. So he went back to Earth, but then the sun on his face, the enjoyments of the flesh, he decided he didn't want to go back to the underworld. He was given messages and ordered to come back. He refused, so finally Mercury came and seized the impudent man by the collar, and snatching him from his joys, led him forcibly back to the underworld, where his rock was ready for him. You have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero. He is as much through his passions as through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. That is the price that must be paid for the passions of this earth. So then he describes how he's pushing up this huge rock, and he's got his cheek all crammed against it, and his shoulder and his foot is wedged out in the earth, and the earth-clotted hands. So he finally gets it to the top. And then it rolls back down again. So then on the right-hand column, 560, it is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. So as Sisyphus is walking back down the mountain to go push the rock back up again, in that interim period, that is the mythological example of the absurd man, the absurd human being who embraces absurdity and enjoys life despite the meaninglessness of it all. So that hour, like a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering, that is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks toward the lairs of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. So he's going to compare this to the workman of today, the proletariat. He says, the workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. So he's thinking of his wretched condition during his descent back to the rock. So the lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. If the descent is thus sometimes performed in sorrow, it can also take place in joy. So that's a bold statement here. He's saying there is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. I don't know what proof he has for that, but this is what he's stating. So continuing here, he says, when the images of earth cling too tightly to memory, when the call of happiness becomes too insistent, it happens that melancholy rises in man's heart. This is the rock's victory. This is the rock itself. The boundless grief is too heavy to bear. These are our nights of Gethsemane. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus sweated blood. He was so intensely worried about the next day upon which he was going to be crucified, and he knew it. So, but crushing truths perish from being acknowledged. Thus, Oedipus at the outset obeys fate without knowing it, but from the moment he knows it, his tragedy begins. So then he goes on to talk about the myth of Oedipus. So Oedipus, the word means, I think, wounded foot. At any rate, when he was born, his parents heard some omen that he would have sex with his mother and kill his father, so they pierced his foot with a needle and left him out in the plains to die, but one of the servants, I believe, saved him. Anyway, he grew up, and then he's going down the road one day, and it's a narrow road, and the man coming towards him won't step aside, and neither will he, so they end up fighting, and he kills the man, who turned out to be his father. That man was the king. According to the customs of that city, if you kill the king, you get to marry the queen, who was his mother. When he realized all this had happened, still, despite it all, he plunged out his own eyes. But then a young girl reached out to him, and he held her hand, and he said, all is well. So despite all of his horrible, tragic fate, he still says, all is well. So then he'll go on to say, Sophocles' Oedipus, like Dostoevsky's Kirillov, thus gives the recipe for the absurd victory. Ancient wisdom confirms modern heroism. So Kirillov is a character from Dostoevsky's novel, The Devils or the Possessed, and he realized, I did read it, but it's been a while, but it was that if God doesn't exist, then the world is meaningless. And so he killed himself to kind of prove that God does exist. I think it was some twisted thing, or that he was going to become God by killing himself. At any rate, we're just going to focus on Sisyphus here. So he says, one does not discover the absurd without being tempted to write a manual of happiness. What? By such narrow ways? He puts that in quotation marks. There is but one world, however. Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. He goes, so when he says about Oedipus, I conclude that all is well, says Oedipus, and that remark is sacred. It echoes in the wild and limited universe of man. It teaches that all is not, has not been exhausted. It drives out of this world a God who had come into it with dissatisfaction and a preference for futile sufferings. It makes of fate a human matter which must be settled among men. So the God who had come into it with dissatisfaction and a preference for futile sufferings is Jesus Christ. So the Christian religion is being driven out by the recognition that all is well despite the fact that we live in a limited, meaningless universe. This is what he's saying. To replace the Christian belief in a meaningful universe created by God and really being the embodiment of God, the absurd realization acknowledges the soullessness of the universe and yet still says it's worth living. So continuing here, all Sisyphus' silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silences all the idols. In the universe, suddenly restored to its silence, the myriad wandering little voices of the earth rise up, unconscious secret calls, invitations from all the faces. They are the necessary reverse and price of victory. There is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night. Continuing here a little bit, and we're closing in on the end. For the rest, he knows himself to be the master of his days. At that subtle moment when man glances backward over his life, Sisyphus returning toward his rock, in that slight pivoting he contemplates that series of unrelated actions which becomes his fate, created by him, combined under his memory's eye, and soon sealed by his death. Thus, convinced of the wholly human origin of all that is human, a blind man, eager to see, who knows that the night has no end, he is still on the go. The rock is still rolling. So this is the last paragraph. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the highest fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Okay, so that was going over Exam 6, Part A, Question 3. Camus, Taylor, Wolfe, and Vitrano present more recent discussions of the meaning of life. What do you find most insightful in these writings? Why? And explain. So for Camus, there is no meaning in life. And he gives his reasons why, and he says, how do you deal with the meaninglessness of life? You embrace that consciousness of the absurdity of it all, and you live your life anyway, resolutely rejecting death by refusing suicide. Part B, Question 6, explain Camus' discussion of suicide. Why wouldn't you commit suicide if you realized life has no meaning? It's just a futile suffering for no purpose. And then Camus will say, well, the recognition of the futility of it all awakens you from the droning life of habit. Now you've become a fully human being, aware of your absurd condition. Just embrace that and reject death. Death is inevitable, but you revolt against it. You're a rebel to the end, knowing that you have no hope of victory. Living in that awareness is what he's calling embracing the absurd. So Part B, question 7. Explain Camus' comments on the myth of Sisyphus. So Sisyphus is the mythological archetype of this realization of the absurd. Life is the daily grind toward no ultimate purpose in this meaningless, finite universe that will be snuffed out in the end, and all memory of everything will be gone. Pushing that rock up the hill every day, that's life. But there's another side of life, which is when the rock rolls back down and Sisyphus has to walk back down the hill towards his fate. He has the time to contemplate how meaningless his suffering is. And if he embraces that recognition, he can still be happy, because it's still an entire experience. He's still alive, and life itself, the burning flame of the desire for life itself, is the passion that we can embrace. All right, so I've been over these. That was just a brief overview, and that will be enough for Camus.